After I gave up everything for him, he divorced me. That was what everyone in the courtroom believed the story would be. They believed I had sacrificed 12 years only to become another forgotten housewife with nothing left to fight for. My husband stood only a few feet away from me, perfectly pressed suit, expensive watch catching the cold morning light that slipped through the courthouse windows in downtown Chicago. He never looked at me. Not once. His attorney gathered a neat stack of papers, smiled without warmth, and said, "Mrs. Brooks, these documents should finally help everyone move on." I reached for the envelope with hands that felt strangely calm. The paper was heavier than I expected. Divorce always looks lighter from a distance. "You always knew this day would come," Ryan whispered as he walked past me. "You stopped growing a long time ago." I watched him disappear through the security doors while people hurried around us carrying coffee, briefcases, and conversations that had nothing to do with lives falling apart. For one long moment, I simply stood there, holding 12 years inside a manila envelope. Then his attorney looked directly at me and quietly added, "My client has built an extraordinary career. You have not. Please do not make this more difficult than it already is." The words landed softly. Somehow that made them hurt more. They did not know that those few seconds inside the courthouse lobby would become the beginning of a story none of them were prepared to hear. Before I continue, if this story speaks to your heart, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. I would also love to know where you are watching from today. Tell me your city, your country, and your local time in the comments, because it always amazes me how stories can connect people across the world. My name is Emma Brooks. I am 35 years old, and the morning my husband handed me divorce papers was the morning everything I believed about family, loyalty, and love quietly collapsed. Looking back now, I realize that was not the day my marriage ended. It was simply the day everyone else finally noticed the cracks that had been spreading for years. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood, printer toner, and rain carried in from Michigan Avenue. Outside, October wind pushed yellow leaves across the sidewalk. Inside, people waited for hearings that would change their lives forever. Mine had already changed before the judge ever entered the room. Ryan had arrived 20 minutes earlier than necessary. He always liked arriving first. It made him feel prepared, important, in control. His mother, Patricia, adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, as though attending a charity luncheon instead of her son's divorce hearing. "Emma," she said with a practiced smile, "you look tired." "Good morning, Patricia. You really should have taken better care of yourself these last few years." Ryan sighed before I could answer. "Mom, there is no point." Patricia lowered her voice just enough to sound compassionate. "I warned you, sweetheart. Men need wives they can admire, not women who disappear into kitchens." I almost laughed. Kitchens, laundry rooms, holiday dinners, hospital visits for Ryan's father, birthday parties, every Thanksgiving turkey that arrived on time, every Christmas morning carefully wrapped before anyone else woke up. Apparently those things disappeared the moment they were finished. Olivia, Ryan's younger sister, arrived balancing an iced coffee in one hand and her phone in the other. She barely looked at me. "So this is finally happening," she said. Honestly, Ryan deserves someone who matches his ambition. Ryan did not disagree. That hurt more than anything she said. "Olivia," I answered quietly. "Good morning." She shrugged. "You always were too nice. It made people underestimate you." She smiled as though she had offered me a compliment. The bailiff opened another courtroom door nearby. Lawyers moved past carrying thick binders. Someone cried softly down the hallway. Life kept moving. Mine seemed frozen. Richard Hale approached with measured confidence, every step polished by decades inside courtrooms. Missiscating sound. "Brooks," he said, extending a folder toward me, "I suggest you review the financial disclosures carefully. There is not much complexity here." "I understand." "Good." He smiled politely. "Cases like these are unfortunate. One spouse builds a successful future, while the other simply remains dependent." He paused before delivering the final sentence with almost surgical precision. "The court generally recognizes contribution. Unfortunately, being supportive is not the same as being valuable." I looked directly into his eyes. "Is that what you believe?" "It is what evidence usually shows." Ryan adjusted his cufflinks. "Emma, please do not make today emotional." I nodded once. "I will not." He seemed relieved. That relief stayed on his face because he mistook silence for surrender. He had been making that mistake for years. My attorney, Daniel Foster, arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase instead of the expensive designer bags every other lawyer seemed to prefer. His gray hair was slightly windblown. "Sorry I am late," he said. Traffic on Lakeshore Drive was backed up. He looked at me carefully. "How are you holding up?" "I am here." He gave one slow nod. "That is enough for today." Richard walked over with a confident smile. "Daniel, good to see you." "Richard, I trust your client understands the reality of the situation." Daniel smiled pleasantly. "Reality has a way of revealing itself," Richard chuckled. "Not much to reveal here." Daniel said nothing else. He simply opened his briefcase, removed a thin legal pad and placed it on the bench beside me. There were almost no papers inside. I found that strange. Every attorney around us seemed buried beneath documents except mine. "Do we have everything?" I whispered. "For today," Daniel answered. "More than enough." He closed the briefcase before I could ask another question. As we waited for the courtroom doors to open, my phone vibrated once inside my purse. I almost ignored it. Almost. Unknown number. One new voicemail. No message preview. I silenced the phone without listening. A few seconds later, another notification appeared. This time, it was only a calendar reminder I did not remember creating years ago. Annual Executive Review. 9 o'clock sharp. I stared at the words for a moment before locking the screen. Daniel noticed. "Everything all right?" Probably an old reminder. He studied my face for a second longer than necessary but did not ask another question. Across the hallway, Ryan laughed quietly with Richard about a golf tournament planned for the following weekend. Patricia complimented the receptionist's flowers. Olivia was already posting something on social media. Nobody noticed that old reminder on my phone. Nobody wondered why my expression changed for only a heartbeat. And as the courtroom doors finally opened, I realized there was one question nobody had asked me in almost 12 years, and for the first time, I began to wonder whether that question had been hidden from me just as carefully as I had been hidden from everyone else. The bailiff held the courtroom door open, but nobody moved immediately. Lawyers checked calendars. A young couple whispered to each other across the hallway. Somewhere behind me, a vending machine hummed with the steady sound of ordinary life continuing while mine seemed suspended between two breaths. I slipped my phone back into my purse after dismissing the strange calendar reminder, but the words refused to leave my mind. Annual Executive Review. 9 o'clock sharp. It sounded important, yet strangely distant, like a voice from another life that had been buried beneath grocery lists, dinner reservations, holiday planning, and years of learning how to make myself smaller. Ryan glanced at his watch. "Emma." His tone was flat, impatient. "We should go inside. I am coming." "Please," he said quietly, "do not turn today into something dramatic." I almost smiled. 12 years ago, he would have reached for my hand before walking into any room. Now he walked ahead without checking whether I followed. As I watched him disappear through the courtroom doors, I noticed the slight crease near the shoulder of his navy suit. I remembered steaming that jacket at 6 o'clock one morning before one of his biggest client presentations because he had spilled coffee on it while answering emails. That tiny wrinkle carried me backward without warning. We had been married barely 8 months then, living in a modest townhouse outside Chicago, with furniture we bought secondhand and dreams that still sounded possible. Ryan had stood in our tiny kitchen wearing that same suit while balancing a mug in one hand and legal documents in the other. "They are talking about making me partner one day," he had said, unable to hide the excitement in his voice. "Can you imagine that?" I laughed and kissed his cheek. "I already can." He looked at me with genuine warmth. "I could not do this without you." At the time, I believed him. We were equals then, or at least I thought we were. I still had my own office, my own schedule, my own professional goals. My desk overlooked the Chicago River, and every Friday afternoon sunlight reflected off the glass buildings across the water while I finished reports before heading home. I loved solving complicated problems. I loved boardrooms filled with ideas. I loved feeling responsible for something bigger than myself. Then one evening Ryan came home unusually quiet. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase beside the dining table, and stared at the stack of unopened mail. "What happened?" I asked. the promotion. He sat down slowly. I have a real chance this time. That is wonderful. It is also going to mean longer hours, more travel, more dinners with clients. I reached across the table. We will figure it out. He squeezed my hand. There is something else. I waited. The partners. They notice everything. What do you mean? Their wives are always available. Every event, every dinner, every fundraiser. I laughed softly. I can attend dinners. He shook his head. Not just dinners. They build a certain image. I did not understand at first. Ryan? He hesitated before saying the sentence that would quietly reshape my life. Maybe one career is enough for our family. I remember staring at him while the dishwasher hummed behind us. You are asking me to quit? Not forever. He smiled gently. Just until I am established. How long is that? A couple of years. 2 years sounded reasonable. Temporary. Loving. Like something partners did for each other. I told myself sacrifices were supposed to feel uncomfortable. The next week my manager, Grace Mitchell, invited me into her office. She closed the glass door and folded her hands on the conference table. Ryan received good news? She asked after I gave my notice. I nodded. His career is taking off. Grace watched me carefully. And yours? This is the right decision. She leaned back without arguing. Emma, I hired you because you solve problems most people never even notice. Thank you. If you ever change your mind. She slid a business card toward me. Keep this. I tucked it into my wallet without thinking much about it. I never threw it away. The memory dissolved as someone brushed past me in the courthouse hallway, carrying a cardboard archive box filled with legal files. Daniel stood beside me now, quietly reviewing the morning docket. You disappeared for a minute, he said. Just remembering something. He nodded as though memories were evidence too. They usually arrive when we least expect them. We entered the courtroom together. The polished wooden benches reflected the pale morning light. The judge had not entered yet. Ryan sat with Richard several rows ahead, speaking in low voices. Patricia leaned toward Olivia and whispered something that made them both smile. I chose the opposite table without saying a word. While everyone settled into their seats, another memory surfaced, carried not by a place this time, but by the sound of papers being organized. About 3 years after I left my career, Ryan came home celebrating another promotion. I had spent all afternoon preparing dinner because his parents were coming over. Patricia walked through the front door carrying flowers. The house looks beautiful, she said before handing them to me. Thank you. She smiled politely. You always did have time for details. During dinner, Ryan's father raised his glass. To Ryan, everything this family has today comes from your hard work. Everyone applauded. Ryan smiled modestly. Nobody looked toward me. Patricia reached across the table and patted my hand. You should be proud. Supporting a successful husband is one of the most meaningful things a woman can do. I smiled because everyone expected me to. Ryan never corrected her. He never said I had once built things of my own. Later that night I asked him quietly while loading the dishwasher, "Did it bother you that nobody mentioned me?" He frowned. Mentioned you for what? Nothing. He kissed my forehead. Emma, you worry too much. Maybe I did. Or maybe that was simply the first night I realized disappearing could happen so gradually that the people who loved you never noticed you were gone. All rise, the bailiff announced, pulling me back into the present. Everyone stood as the judge entered. I reached into my purse for a tissue and accidentally touched something tucked beneath my wallet. It was an old business card. Grace Mitchell. I stared at the slightly worn edges. Someone had written a note on the back in blue ink years earlier. It was not my handwriting, and I had absolutely no memory of ever reading the single sentence that suddenly made my heart beat slow instead of race. My thumb rested against the faded business card while the judge reviewed the morning schedule in an even, measured voice. I could hear pages turning throughout the courtroom, the soft scrape of chairs against polished wood, the distant rumble of traffic filtering through thick courthouse windows. The note written on the back of Grace Mitchell's card was only 6 words long. Call me before you sign anything. I stared at the handwriting, trying to remember when she had written it. I could not. My memory carried fragments instead of complete pictures now, as though the past had become a house with several locked rooms. Mrs. Brooks? Daniel whispered beside me. Are you all right? I slipped the card back into my wallet. I found something I forgot I had. He studied my expression without pressing further. Sometimes forgotten things return exactly when they are needed. Before I could answer, Richard Hale stood and approached our table with a confident smile that belonged to someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. Daniel. He placed another folder on the polished surface between us. One more document for your client. Daniel did not touch it immediately. What is it? A revised settlement proposal. My client has been generous. Ryan remained seated a few feet away, scrolling through emails on his phone as though dissolving a 12-year marriage was another appointment squeezed between meetings. Richard continued, If Mrs. Brooks signs today, we can avoid unnecessary complications. Daniel finally opened the folder. His eyes moved slowly across the pages. Interesting. Richard smiled wider. I thought you would agree. Daniel closed the folder again and slid it toward me. Take your time before reading it. Richard adjusted his cuff. There really is not much to consider. I looked at the first page. Most of the legal language blurred together until my eyes stopped on one paragraph. Personal property, home furnishings, financial accounts, future claims, intellectual property. Business interests. I read the last phrase again. Business interests. Ryan finally looked up. Emma, it is standard language, is it? You do not have any business interests. Patricia leaned forward from the row behind him. Ryan has explained everything to us. The settlement is more than fair. Olivia folded her arms. Honestly, Emma, this is becoming embarrassing. Everybody knows Ryan earned what he has. I looked down at the paper again. The phrase remained exactly where it had been. Business interests. Daniel quietly asked, Would you like a few minutes? Yes. We stepped into the hallway outside the courtroom while the next case was called. The corridor felt cooler now. A maintenance worker slowly polished brass railings at the far end, while two young attorneys argued over filing deadlines near the elevators. Daniel waited until they walked away before speaking. Tell me what caught your attention. I handed him the document without answering. He read the highlighted paragraph carefully. This clause? I nodded. Why? I hesitated longer than I intended, because it feels broader than it should. How so? I searched for the right words. Ryan never cared about paperwork unless someone else prepared it. He would never ask for language this specific. Daniel looked through the remaining pages again. You think someone intentionally expanded the clause? Maybe. He closed the folder thoughtfully. Then we do not sign today. Will that make things worse? Not if there is a reason to wait. Before I could respond, Ryan stepped into the hallway. Emma, what exactly are we doing? His voice remained calm, but there was irritation beneath it now. Reviewing documents. They are standard documents. Then waiting one day should not matter. He laughed quietly without humor. You have never cared about contracts. The sentence lingered between us. Never cared about contracts. I almost corrected him before stopping myself. Instead, I asked, why include business interests? Ryan shrugged. Because lawyers include everything. Richard joined him a moment later. Precisely. It protects everyone. Daniel folded the settlement packet and slipped it back into its envelope. Then my client will review everything carefully before making any decisions. Richard's smile tightened for the first time that morning. There is nothing hidden here. Daniel answered evenly. Excellent. Then an extra day should concern no one. Ryan looked directly at me. You are making this more difficult than it needs to be. Am I? Yes. His voice softened. Emma, there is nothing left to protect. I met his eyes. That depends on what you believe belongs to me. He frowned, clearly confused by my answer. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. I realized something strange then. Ryan genuinely believed he knew every important part of my life. He believed 12 years together had revealed everything worth knowing. That certainty made him comfortable. It also made him careless. The judge called our case into the courtroom again. As we returned to our seats, the settlement envelope remained unopened in Daniel's hands. During a short recess, an older court clerk approached our table carrying several administrative forms. She glanced at my identification before smiling politely. Mrs. Brooks, I just need you to verify your current mailing address. Of course. She handed me a clipboard. I signed beside my printed name, then returned it. She looked down briefly before pausing. Interesting. What is it? I asked. Nothing important. She flipped another page. It is probably a database error. Daniel looked up. What kind of error? There is a secondary business correspondence address still attached to Mrs. Brooks's profile. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. Can you remove it? She nodded. Certainly. She typed a few notes into her tablet. It has been inactive for years anyway. Ryan barely looked up from his phone. See, he said. Old records never get updated. Nobody else seemed interested. The clerk apologized for the inconvenience and walked away. Daniel remained unusually quiet. Several seconds later, he leaned slightly toward me without taking his eyes off the courtroom calendar posted across the room. Emma. Yes? Have you ever used that address? I opened my mouth, but no answer came immediately because I honestly could not remember. Somewhere deep beneath years of ordinary routines, forgotten obligations, and carefully constructed silence, something shifted. Then I realized the address the clerk had mentioned was not one I had forgotten. It was one I had never been told still existed, and someone had quietly kept it alive all these years. Daniel did not ask another question after I admitted I could not remember the address. He simply nodded once, folded the settlement packet, and placed it back inside his worn leather briefcase. The courtroom slowly emptied for the lunch recess. Conversations echoed beneath the high marble ceilings, while attorneys compared schedules and clients drifted toward the elevators in small groups. Ryan crossed the hallway with Patricia and Olivia, laughing quietly about a restaurant a few blocks away. For the first time all morning, they looked relaxed. They believed the hardest part of the day was already behind them. Daniel turned to me. Have you eaten? I realized I had not touched food since early morning. No. Come with me. There is a small cafe downstairs. We stepped into the old courthouse elevator. The brass doors closed with a dull metallic sound that reminded me of office buildings I had not entered in years. Nobody spoke during the ride. Daniel seemed content to let silence do its work. When the doors opened, we walked through the lobby where sunlight poured across polished stone floors. The cafe occupied one corner of the building, filled with courthouse employees balancing sandwiches, legal pads, and paper coffee cups. Daniel ordered black coffee. I chose hot tea I knew I would barely drink. We found a small table near the window overlooking the busy street. You are trying very hard to remember something, Daniel said after a long pause. I looked into the steam rising from my cup. It feels like pieces of my own life were packed into boxes I never opened again. That happens more often than people realize. Does it? Especially to people who spend years taking care of everyone except themselves. Before I answered, someone stopped beside our table. Excuse me. The voice carried quiet confidence rather than hesitation. I looked up. A silver-haired man in his late 60s stood holding a tray with soup and a sandwich. His posture was straight despite his age, his navy blazer perfectly fitted, a small American flag pin fastened neatly to the lapel. For one brief second, he simply looked at me. Then his expression softened into genuine recognition. Miss Carter. I blinked. Nobody had called me by my maiden name in over a decade. I am sorry, I said carefully. Have we met? He smiled. You probably do not remember me. He extended his hand. Thomas Whitaker. The name stirred something distant. A conference room, whiteboards, long evenings, coffee growing cold beside stacks of reports. Before I could place him completely, he continued, You helped my organization through one of the most difficult periods we ever faced. I have never forgotten your kindness. Daniel watched quietly without interrupting. I stood and shook his hand. It has been a long time. Too long. Thomas looked at me with unmistakable respect. I heard you had stepped away from your career. I was surprised. The world does not produce many people with your steady judgment. He chose his words carefully, as though avoiding saying too much. Thank you, I replied softly. That means more than you know. He smiled again. I always hoped our paths would cross one more time. A courthouse employee approached him carrying several folders. Mr. Whitaker, Judge Ellison is ready whenever you are. Thank you. He turned back toward me. Take care of yourself, Miss Carter. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, Do not let anyone convince you that your work disappeared simply because fewer people could see it. He gave Daniel a polite nod before walking away. Neither man offered an explanation. Neither seemed to think one was necessary. Daniel waited until Thomas disappeared around the corner before speaking. Interesting. You know him? By reputation. Who is he? Daniel stirred his coffee slowly. A respected former federal mediator. He has advised governors, judges, and several large organizations over the years. I had forgotten. Apparently he had not. I lowered my eyes to the table. The tea had already cooled. Across the cafe windows, I suddenly noticed Ryan standing just outside on the sidewalk. Patricia and Olivia were beside him. All three had stopped walking. Ryan was looking directly through the glass toward our table. His expression was different now. Not angry, not jealous, simply confused. As we left the cafe a few minutes later, we met them again near the courthouse entrance. Patricia smiled politely, though curiosity had replaced her usual confidence. "Emma," she said. "Who was that gentleman?" "Someone I knew years ago." Olivia folded her arms. "He seemed awfully happy to see you." "He was being kind." Ryan frowned. "Why did he call you Miss Carter?" "That was my name before we married." "I know that." His voice sharpened slightly. "But why did he know it?" I answered honestly. "I am not sure." Richard approached, carrying another folder beneath his arm. "Everything all right?" Ryan kept watching me. "Apparently Emma has influential friends we never heard about." Richard glanced toward the lobby where Thomas Whitaker had disappeared. Recognition flashed across his face for the briefest moment. It vanished almost immediately, replaced by professional calm. "Mr. Whitaker speaks with many people," he said casually. I would not read too much into it, but his tone lacked conviction. Even Patricia seemed uncertain now. Daniel stepped beside me. "We should head back upstairs." We walked away together without another word. Inside the elevator, I caught Ryan watching me in the polished brass reflection instead of looking directly at my face. It was the first time all day that he seemed unable to predict what I might do next. When we returned to the courtroom floor, I glanced once more toward the hallway where Thomas Whitaker had disappeared. He never looked back, yet somehow his quiet recognition had changed the air around me in a way none of us could explain. And when I noticed Richard Hale quietly making a phone call the moment he thought nobody was watching, I realized someone else had finally begun asking questions about the woman they believed they already understood. Richard ended the call before anyone reached him. By the time we returned to our seats, he had already recovered the smooth confidence he carried like another tailored suit. If the conversation had unsettled him, he did not allow it to remain visible. Still, I noticed something different. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward me, not with contempt anymore, but with calculation. It was the kind of look lawyers gave evidence they had not expected to find. The afternoon hearing moved slowly. Administrative questions. Scheduling discussions. Deadlines. Nothing dramatic. Yet beneath every ordinary sentence, I could feel something quietly changing. Ryan no longer leaned back with the easy certainty he had carried all morning. Instead, he watched Daniel more closely than he watched the judge. During another short recess, Daniel gathered his files without rushing. "Walk with me," he said. We stepped into a quieter corridor, lined with tall windows overlooking the river. The October sunlight had softened into pale gold, stretching long reflections across the marble floor. "I requested additional discovery this afternoon," Daniel said. Richard did not seem pleased. "Why?" "Because I asked for documents he assumed nobody would ever ask to see." I looked at him carefully. "Did you find something?" He smiled faintly. "Not yet, but people reveal themselves when they believe they are already winning." We continued walking until we reached a small seating area overlooking the city. A courthouse employee passed us carrying several archive boxes. Somewhere below, a siren echoed through downtown traffic before fading into the distance. Daniel opened his notebook. "Emma, I want to ask you something, and I do not want you to answer unless you are absolutely certain." "All right. When you left your career, did you resign completely?" The question settled over us. I thought back to Grace's office, the business card, the strange note written on the back, the memories that refused to return in order. "I believed I did," I answered slowly. "Believed?" "I remember signing paperwork. I remember packing my office." But, some parts feel unfinished. Daniel nodded as though my answer confirmed something rather than confused it. Memory is interesting under long periods of emotional pressure. What are you saying? Only that people sometimes remember decisions while forgetting the conversations surrounding them. Before I could ask another question, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and immediately excused himself. "Take your time. I need to return this call." I remained alone beside the windows. Across the river, sunlight reflected from dozens of office buildings, and for one strange moment they looked painfully familiar. My eyes settled on one tower several blocks away. I knew those windows. I knew the lobby with the white marble floor. I knew the conference room on the 21st floor where people once argued over impossible deadlines while I filled whiteboards with solutions. The memory arrived without warning. Grace standing beside a projector. "Emma, everyone is waiting for your recommendation." Someone sliding financial reports across the table. A man laughing after I solved a problem nobody else could untangle. Then the memory disappeared almost as quickly as it had come. "Emma?" I turned. Grace Mitchell herself stood several feet away. She wore a charcoal coat over a navy dress, a leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm. Time had added a few silver strands to her hair but had changed little else. For a heartbeat neither of us spoke. Then she smiled warmly. "You still look at buildings before you look at people." I laughed softly. "Apparently I do." She stepped closer and embraced me briefly. It was not dramatic. It felt familiar, comfortable, earned. "I heard you were here," she said. "Word travels quickly around this courthouse." "I suppose it does." She studied my face with quiet concern. "How are you holding up?" "I am still standing." "That sounds like you." Before I could respond, Daniel returned. Grace. Daniel. They greeted each other as old colleagues rather than strangers. Ryan emerged from the courtroom at the same moment. He stopped mid-step when he saw us together. "Emma?" His voice carried open confusion now. "You know Grace Mitchell?" Grace turned politely. "Ryan Brooks, I assume." "Yes." He extended his hand automatically. She shook it with professional courtesy. "Pleasure to meet you." Ryan looked from her to me. "You never told me you two knew each other." Grace answered before I could. "Emma and I worked together years ago." Ryan smiled with visible relief. "Before she left the workforce." Grace's expression changed almost imperceptibly. If that is how you understand it, the silence that followed lasted only a second, but everyone seemed to notice it. Patricia stepped into the hallway beside Ryan. "Emma always speaks highly of the people she worked with." Grace smiled politely. "She usually speaks more highly of others than herself." Olivia folded her arms. "Well, that chapter ended a long time ago." Grace looked at me before answering. "Some chapters do not end simply because people stop reading them." Nobody spoke after that. Grace excused herself with quiet professionalism. "Daniel, I will send over the material we discussed." "Thank you." She turned back toward me one last time. "Take care, Emma." "You too." Ryan watched her disappear down the corridor. "Material?" he repeated. Daniel closed his notebook. "Professional correspondence." Richard appeared a moment later, carrying a fresh stack of documents. "Everything ready?" he asked Ryan. Ryan barely heard him. His eyes remained fixed on the hallway where Grace had vanished. Did Emma really just happen to run into two respected professionals in one day? Richard answered too quickly. "Coincidences happen." But his voice lacked the confidence it carried that morning. As court resumed, I noticed Ryan no longer looked at me as though I were simply the woman who had spent 12 years arranging dinners and folding laundry. For the first time since handing me those divorce papers, he looked at me as though he had begun to suspect there were entire years of my life he had never actually bothered to understand, and that realization frightened him far more than anything either lawyer had said. Ryan did not speak as we returned to the courtroom. The confidence that had carried him through the morning had become something quieter, something far less comfortable. It showed itself in small ways. He checked his phone every few minutes without actually reading the screen. He straightened papers that were already perfectly aligned. He asked Richard the same question twice. "We are still on schedule, right?" Richard answered without looking up. "Everything is under control." But the certainty in his voice sounded practiced now instead of natural. I took my seat beside Daniel while the judge reviewed the afternoon docket. Outside the tall windows, gray clouds had begun drifting across the Chicago skyline, softening the sunlight until the courtroom felt wrapped in muted autumn light. The room had grown quieter. Even the spectators waiting for later hearings seemed to sense that something invisible had shifted. Daniel leaned toward me. "Whatever happens this afternoon, answer only what you are asked." I nodded. "I understand. You do not have to defend your life today." I looked at him. "Then what do I have to do?" "Tell the truth when it becomes necessary." The judge called our case. Richard stood first, calm and polished. "Your Honor, we believe this matter remains straightforward. My client requests that the proposed settlement proceed without unnecessary delay." The judge adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Foster?" Daniel rose slowly. "Your Honor, before discussing settlement, we respectfully request additional time regarding several financial disclosures that appear incomplete." Richard answered immediately. "There are no incomplete disclosures." Daniel remained composed. "That conclusion may be premature." Ryan shifted beside his attorney. I noticed his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. It was the first outward sign that he no longer felt completely certain. The judge looked toward Daniel. "Can you explain the basis for your request?" "Only in general terms today, Your Honor. We have reason to believe several records require clarification before either party signs a final agreement." Richard gave a short laugh. "Clarification of what exactly?" Daniel met his eyes. "That is precisely what we intend to determine." The judge considered both attorneys for several moments before speaking. "Very well. The court will allow limited supplemental discovery." Richard's expression barely changed, but Ryan turned sharply toward him. "What does that mean?" he whispered. "It means paperwork," Richard answered quietly. "Nothing more." Yet he no longer sounded convinced. Court paused again while administrative scheduling was completed. As people gathered their files, I remained seated, watching tiny dust particles drift through the afternoon light. They reminded me of afternoons years earlier when I had stayed late inside conference rooms after everyone else had gone home. I still could not remember every detail, but the memories no longer felt completely unreachable. They were returning slowly, one piece at a time, like photographs developing inside an old darkroom. "Emma." Ryan's voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked up. He stood beside our table, hands in his pockets. Without Richard or Patricia nearby, he looked strangely familiar, almost like the young man I had married before. Ambition slowly replaced tenderness. "Can we talk?" Daniel glanced toward me. "I will give you a few minutes." He stepped away without another word. Ryan remained standing. "I do not understand what is happening." "Neither do I. Not completely." He studied my face. "Grace. That man from lunch. The address the clerk mentioned." He hesitated. "Why does it feel like everyone knows something I do not?" I answered honestly. "Maybe because we stopped asking each other questions a long time ago." He looked away first. "If there is something important." "Ryan." My voice stayed calm. "When was the last time you asked me what I was thinking instead of telling me what I should do?" He opened his mouth but never answered. Richard approached before the silence became too heavy. "Ryan, we need to leave." Ryan nodded automatically, then looked back at me once more. "You could have told me." I almost said that he had never asked. Instead, I simply replied, "Some conversations require two people willing to listen." He followed Richard toward the hallway without looking back again. Daniel returned carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me, even though he knew I rarely finished it. "How did that go?" He asked questions. "Did he like the answers?" "I do not think he expected them." Daniel smiled faintly. "People rarely expect quiet honesty. They prepare themselves for arguments instead." We left the courtroom together. As we walked through the nearly empty corridor, an elderly records supervisor called after Daniel, "Counselor Foster." He turned. The woman carried a sealed interoffice envelope. "These arrived from archives sooner than expected. Thank you." She lowered her voice slightly. There was one unusual item included. Daniel accepted the envelope. Unusual? It was filed under routine administrative correspondence, even though it probably should not have been. She glanced toward me politely before walking away. Daniel waited until we reached a quieter corner before opening the envelope. Inside were several routine filing notices and one smaller sealed packet marked with an old date from nearly 9 years earlier. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Daniel carefully read the outside label. "Interesting. What is it?" I asked. "It appears someone requested that certain records remain attached to your file rather than be closed." My heartbeat slowed. "Who requested that? That information is inside." Before he could break the seal, Richard rounded the corner unexpectedly. He stopped the instant he saw the packet in Daniel's hands. For the first time since I had met him, his carefully controlled expression disappeared completely. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Daniel looked up calmly. "Court archives." Richard stared at the date written across the front of the sealed packet. His face lost all color. And in that single, silent moment, everyone standing in the hallway understood the same thing. Whatever waited inside that envelope was something at least one person had desperately hoped would never be opened. Richard did not answer Daniel's question immediately. He simply stared at the sealed packet as though it had returned from another lifetime. The hallway suddenly felt much smaller. People continued walking past us carrying briefcases and coffee cups, completely unaware that the balance of an entire divorce case had quietly shifted because of one forgotten envelope. Daniel held the packet without opening it. "Counselor?" he asked evenly. "You seem familiar with this." Richard blinked once before recovering his composure. "Court archives contain thousands of old records. There is nothing unusual about administrative files. Then you have no objection if we review it." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Review whatever you believe is relevant." He turned away a second too quickly. That was enough. Daniel watched him disappear down the corridor before looking at me. People usually reveal more through what frightens them than through what they say. I did not answer. My attention remained on the sealed packet. 9 years. That date echoed inside my mind with growing weight. 9 years ago was not simply another year. It was the period when my memories became strangely uneven, divided between ordinary family routines and brief flashes of another world that I had somehow convinced myself no longer belonged to me. We returned to the courtroom for the final administrative session of the day. The judge scheduled additional filings and postponed final settlement discussions. No dramatic arguments followed. Yet beneath the ordinary legal language, tension continued spreading through everyone involved. Ryan no longer whispered confidently with Richard. Instead, he repeatedly leaned toward him with increasingly anxious questions. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. "Why did he react like that?" Ryan asked quietly. Richard kept his voice low. "He did not react. I saw him. You imagined more than what happened." Ryan shook his head. "No." Richard closed his folder more forcefully than necessary. "Trust me." Across the aisle, Patricia noticed the exchange. After court adjourned, she caught up with her son outside the courtroom doors. "Ryan." "Not now, Mom. What is going on?" He looked around before answering. "I am trying to figure that out." Patricia lowered her voice. "Is Daniel creating problems?" Ryan hesitated. "I do not know if it is Daniel." Olivia joined them, carrying her purse over one shoulder. "Can somebody tell me why everyone suddenly keeps acting like Emma has been hiding classified government secrets?" Ryan gave her a tired look. "Because none of this makes sense anymore. She stayed home for 12 years. Olivia shrugged. "Everybody knows that." Patricia nodded quickly. "Exactly." Ryan rubbed his forehead. "Then explain Grace Mitchell." Neither woman answered. "Explain Thomas Whitaker." Silence. "Explain why Richard looked like he had seen a ghost over one sealed envelope." Patricia looked toward Richard, who was standing alone near a window speaking quietly into his phone again. "Maybe the lawyer is simply being careful." Ryan did not sound convinced. "Or maybe somebody failed to tell me something." At that moment, Richard ended his call and walked toward them. "Everything is fine." Ryan looked directly at him. "Then, open the envelope." Richard stopped. "That is not how legal procedure works." "Why not?" "Because we review evidence through proper channels." Ryan folded his arms. "You said there was nothing inside worth worrying about." "I said we should follow procedure." Patricia glanced between them with growing unease. "Richard, please." He forced a polite smile. "Everyone needs to remain patient." Olivia looked from one face to another. "This is ridiculous." She laughed nervously. "Emma probably forgot some old tax paperwork." Nobody laughed with her. I remained several yards away beside Daniel, pretending to study the courthouse directory while their conversation drifted through the hallway. I felt no satisfaction listening to them, only sadness. 12 years earlier, we had all celebrated birthdays together. We had shared holiday dinners, hospital visits, and family photographs. Watching suspicion slowly replace certainty did not feel like victory. It felt like watching an old house reveal the cracks that had always existed beneath fresh paint. Daniel quietly broke the silence beside me. "You are not enjoying this." "No, most people expect they will." I looked toward Ryan. I spent too many years loving that family to enjoy watching them fall apart. Daniel nodded with quiet understanding. "That is why you still have your dignity." As we walked toward the elevators, I heard raised voices behind us. Ryan had stopped walking. "Richard, answer one question." Richard remained calm. "I already have." "No." Ryan's voice rose slightly. "Did you know something about Emma before taking this case?" Richard hesitated. "Patricia noticed it too." "Richard?" she asked softly. "No," he answered. "Not specifically." Ryan stared at him. "Not specifically? I knew she had a professional background before marriage. That is not what I asked." Olivia stepped between them. "Ryan, this is getting out of hand." "No." He shook his head. "What is getting out of hand is realizing I may have walked into court without understanding the person I have been married to." Patricia's confidence finally cracked. "Richard, did you investigate Emma?" He answered carefully. "Standard background research." "And?" Richard adjusted his briefcase. "Nothing that changes the legal issues." Ryan took one slow step closer. "Then why are you avoiding every direct question?" Richard looked away instead of answering immediately. That single movement changed everything. Patricia saw it. Olivia saw it. Even Ryan seemed startled by what silence could reveal. Before another word could be spoken, a courthouse deputy approached Daniel. "Counselor Foster?" "Yes?" "The clerk asked me to give you this." He handed Daniel a small evidence receipt with an attached note. Daniel read it once, then handed it to me. It confirmed that the sealed packet had already been transferred into the official case record for judicial review. No one could quietly remove it now. No one could make it disappear. Richard read the receipt over Ryan's shoulder. The color drained from his face again. Ryan slowly lowered the paper and looked at his own attorney with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger. It was the first unmistakable sign that trust itself had begun slipping away, and as the elevator doors closed between us, I realized Ryan was no longer afraid of me. He was beginning to fear the people who had promised they already knew the whole truth. The courthouse felt quieter the next morning. Perhaps it was the weather. Low clouds hung above the city, and a light rain softened every sound outside the tall windows. Or perhaps the silence came from something else entirely. People no longer looked at me with casual certainty. They looked at me with questions. I had spent so many years becoming invisible that being noticed again felt unfamiliar. Daniel and I entered the courtroom without rushing. He carried the same worn leather briefcase. I carried nothing except a small notebook and the habit of breathing slowly whenever life became uncertain. "How did you sleep?" he asked. "Not very much." "Did you worry?" I smiled faintly. "Less than I expected." He nodded. "That usually means you have stopped trying to control what is no longer yours to control." His words stayed with me long after we sat down. Across the room, Ryan looked older than he had only one day before. There were faint shadows beneath his eyes, and his tie was slightly crooked, something that would have bothered him before. Patricia sat beside him in unusual silence. Olivia kept checking her phone, avoiding everyone's eyes. Richard arranged documents carefully, but the confidence that once guided every movement had become measured caution. The hearing itself was brief. Administrative matters continued while additional records were prepared. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody delivered dramatic speeches. Yet every answer seemed heavier than the one before it. When the judge recessed for the afternoon, people drifted into the hallway again. Ryan approached me slowly. This time there was no frustration in his expression, only exhaustion. "Emma." "Hello, Ryan." He looked at the floor before meeting my eyes. "I have been thinking." "I know." He gave a quiet, almost embarrassed laugh. "You always knew when I was pretending not to think. You became easy to read after enough years." We stood together near one of the courthouse windows where rain traced slow lines across the glass. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked, "When did we stop talking to each other?" I considered the question carefully. "Not all at once." He waited. "It happened in small moments. Every time I said I was tired, and you answered with advice instead of listening. Every time I wanted to tell you something important, but your phone rang first. Every time I convinced myself there would be a better moment tomorrow." He closed his eyes briefly. "I remember believing I was doing everything for us. I believe you were. Then how did we end up here?" I looked beyond the rain toward the Chicago skyline. Sometimes people become so focused on building a successful life that they forget to notice whether the people beside them are slowly disappearing. He did not defend himself. He did not argue. That silence felt more honest than anything we had said in years. Patricia approached cautiously, stopping a respectful distance away. "Emma." I turned toward her. She held her purse tightly with both hands, as though unsure whether she belonged in the conversation. "I owe you something," she said quietly. I waited. "For years, I believed I understood what made a good family." She looked down before continuing. "I praised sacrifice whenever it benefited the people I loved." Her voice softened. "I never asked what it cost you." I saw genuine regret in her face. It did not erase the past, but it no longer needed to. "Thank you for saying that," I replied. She nodded once, unable to say anything more. Olivia remained several steps behind her mother. She finally walked forward with hesitant steps that did not resemble the confidence she once carried. "Emma, I was unfair to you." I smiled gently. "You believed the story you were given. That is not an excuse." "No." I looked at her kindly. "But it is a place to begin." She wiped at one eye quickly before looking away. Watching them struggle with their own memories did not make me feel victorious. I felt something much quieter. Relief. The burden of proving my worth had disappeared the moment I realized I no longer needed anyone else's permission to value my own life. Daniel joined us carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "I thought you might want one." I accepted it with grateful hands. "Thank you." Ryan looked toward Daniel. "You have been protecting her this entire time." Daniel shook his head. "No." Ryan frowned. "Then what have you been doing?" Daniel answered with the same calm voice he always used. "I have simply made sure she had enough room to tell the truth when she was ready." Nobody spoke after that. The rain continued falling outside. Somewhere in another courtroom, a jury was dismissed for lunch. The ordinary sounds of justice moved quietly through the building, reminding me that healing rarely arrived with applause. It arrived one honest conversation at a time. Later that afternoon, Grace called me while I stood alone beneath the covered entrance outside the courthouse. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Better." "That sounds different." I smiled. "It is. No matter what happens in court, remember something." "What?" "The life waiting for you afterward matters even more than the case itself." I looked across the wet sidewalk where people hurried beneath umbrellas toward buses, offices, and homes. Life was continuing for all of them. Mine would continue too. "I think I finally understand that," I said. "Good." She paused before adding, "There are people who still believe in you, Emma. They never stopped." After we ended the call, I remained outside for another minute, breathing cool autumn air. I realized that I was no longer standing at the end of my marriage. I was standing at the beginning of a different life, one that would not be measured by what had been taken from me but by what I chose to build next. As I turned to walk back inside for the final stage of the proceedings, the courthouse clock chimed softly above the entrance, and for the first time in many years, I felt that every painful step behind me had quietly become part of the path leading me toward the person I had never truly stopped being. I did not yet know exactly what tomorrow would bring, but I finally understood that the last chapter of this story would not be about what I had lost. It would be about everything that remained. The final hearing arrived on a clear autumn morning, and for the first time since this journey began, I walked toward the courthouse without feeling as though I were carrying the weight of my entire life on my shoulders. The air was crisp enough to sting my cheeks. Yellow leaves gathered along the sidewalks, and the Chicago River reflected a pale blue sky that had finally replaced days of rain. It felt strangely appropriate, not because every problem had disappeared, but because I no longer expected life to become perfect before I allowed myself to breathe. Daniel met me outside the entrance with the same worn leather briefcase he had carried every day. "Ready?" he asked. I smiled. More than I thought I would be. He nodded once. "Then let us finish this well." The courtroom looked exactly as it had on the first day. The polished wood, the quiet conversations, the careful rhythm of legal procedure. Yet nothing inside that room felt the same. The additional records had now been reviewed through the proper process. Forgotten correspondence, archived filings, executive documentation, and years of legitimate business records had finally been placed into their proper context. Piece by piece, they confirmed what should have been understood long before anyone questioned my worth. I had never simply disappeared. I had continued contributing in ways almost no one around me had bothered to ask about. My years of work had been real. My professional judgment had remained valuable. The court recognized those facts not because of dramatic speeches, but because the documents spoke quietly for themselves. Daniel stood only when necessary. He asked clear questions, presented verified records, and allowed the truth to arrive without performance. I answered honestly whenever the judge addressed me. No more, no less. There was no need to exaggerate pain that had already existed. Across the room, Ryan listened in complete silence. Several times he closed his eyes while the record was read. When proceedings ended, the judge thanked both parties for their professionalism and issued a decision that reflected the documented facts, recognizing the legitimate financial interests, contributions, and legal rights that had been overlooked during the original settlement proposal. No one celebrated. Courtrooms are not places where real victories are loud. They are places where truth eventually finds enough space to breathe. Outside the courtroom, people slowly gathered their belongings. Richard approached Daniel first. "You handled this with integrity," he said quietly. Daniel extended his hand. So did the court. Richard nodded before turning toward me. "Mrs. Brooks." He hesitated. There are moments in every career that remind us never to make assumptions about another person's life. I appreciated that he chose honesty over excuses. "I hope we both remember this one," I replied. He gave a respectful nod before leaving the courthouse without another word. Patricia waited until the hallway had nearly emptied before walking toward me. Her eyes were tired, but softer than I had ever seen them. "Emma," she whispered, "I cannot change the years behind us." "No," I answered gently. "None of us can." Tears gathered in her eyes. "I wish I had asked who you were instead of deciding who you should be." I reached out and squeezed her hand. "Take care of yourself, Patricia." She nodded, understanding that forgiveness and rebuilding are not always the same journey. Olivia hugged me unexpectedly. "I judged you because I thought I understood strength," she said. "I did not." I smiled through my own emotions. "We all keep learning." Ryan remained near the courthouse doors until everyone else had gone. When we were finally alone, he walked toward me slowly. There was no anger left, only honesty. "Emma, Ryan." He looked at the stone floor before speaking. "I spent years believing I had built everything important in my life." His voice trembled slightly. "I never realized how many quiet foundations someone else had been holding together." I remained silent. "I cannot ask you to come back," he continued. "I know that." He took a slow breath. "But I needed you to hear one thing from me." He finally met my eyes. "You were never worthless. I was simply too proud to see your value while you were standing beside me." The words arrived years too late to save a marriage, but not too late to reveal growth. "Thank you for saying that," I answered. "I truly hope you find peace." He gave a small, sad smile. "I hope you do too." We walked away in different directions without bitterness. Some endings do not require another argument. They simply require two people willing to stop carrying what no longer belongs to them. A few weeks later, I met Grace for coffee overlooking the river. She slid a folder across the table. "There is a place for you if you want it," she said. I looked at the folder but did not open it immediately. What if I want something different this time? Grace laughed softly. "Then build something different. You have earned the right to choose." Those words stayed with me. For the first time in many years, my future belonged to me again. I began working with organizations that helped women returning to professional life after years spent caring for family. Every conversation reminded me that hidden potential exists in more people than the world often notices. Experience does not disappear because someone stops receiving a paycheck. Wisdom does not vanish because it is expressed inside a home instead of a boardroom. Dignity never depends on another person's opinion. One quiet afternoon, I opened the small notebook I had carried through every courthouse visit. Inside the back cover rested Grace's old business card, still slightly worn at the edges. I smiled before placing it inside a wooden keepsake box beside family photographs, handwritten recipes from my grandmother, and letters from people who had reminded me who I truly was. It no longer represented unfinished business. It represented the moment I finally remembered myself. If you are listening to my story while carrying your own invisible wounds, I hope you remember this. Protect your kindness, but do not surrender your identity. Love deeply, but never allow another person to become the only voice defining your worth. Starting over is frightening, yet remaining where your spirit slowly disappears is often far more painful. There is quiet courage in choosing yourself with grace instead of anger. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I hope these moments have reminded you that none of us are truly alone in what we carry. If this story touched your heart, I would be grateful if you left a like, subscribed to the channel, and shared your thoughts in the comments. Your words may become encouragement for someone who needs hope today more than either of us will ever know. The greatest victory is not proving your value to those who refuse to see it. The greatest victory is remembering your value before anyone else does. As I left the Riverwalk that evening, a single golden leaf drifted onto the kayak, and instead of fighting the current, it moved peacefully toward the open horizon, exactly where it had been meant to go all along.